Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Will Hopkins. I'm the director of New Hampshire Peace Action. I'm very excited tonight to welcome you all to the fourth installment of a joint project between New Hampshire Peace Action and the United Church of Christ Peace with Justice Advocates mission group of the UCC New Hampshire Conference to explore the spirituality of peacemaking. Want to begin tonight by acknowledging that the land on which we live and do our work was not uninhabited when European settlers arrived here with their ideas of conquest and ownership. For most of us, we're living on the ancestral homelands of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. I want to take a moment to honor with gratitude the land and waterways that they've been stewarding throughout the generations. I want to pause and remember that we live on ground that is sacred, ground that was stolen, ground that cries out for justice and responsible stewardship. May our remembering help us find the courage to do our part to restore wholeness to the earth and all her peoples. So in my work over the past 13 or so years with New Hampshire Peace Action, I have served on what seems like countless committees, and especially since 2016, seen an increase in activist burnout, people losing the will, or maybe it's losing the faith to do this work. A foreboding sense of cynical helplessness tends to creep its way into our being, and it paralyzes a lot of the grassroots leaders who have been instrumental in this work. Frequently, I know I feel that taking root in myself. But I've noticed over the years that some of the people, and certainly one of the groups that I work with, seem immune to that. But not only that, that I find that after I've been in a meeting with the advocates, that I feel that foreboding darkness lift just a little. And I think that there's something to be said for people who do this work who are fueled by something deeper. The folks who do this work in a way that's based in faith. And I'm kind of fascinated by the way that tapping into our spiritual side and the universal truths of human compassion that links all the religions and faiths together, how that can fuel us in our work and how that can keep our work focused in a way that keeps the important things front and center, keeps the humanity of the other front and center. So tonight, we're very excited to welcome back to the spirituality of peacemaking Becky Field, who's an award-winning photographer and author, Dr. Joel Berman, who's a retired family physician and well-known across the state for spreading compassionate listening as a practice for peace building, and also welcome David Grishaw-Jones, who is the pastor at the Durham Community Church. The three of them recently went down to Alabama to do a compassionate listening tour and listen to folks on both sides of the racial tensions that have been in play in Alabama for many, many years. And I'm not sure who wants to go first, so I'm just going to turn it over to the three of you with a thank you very much for being here, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say.
Can you hear me? Everybody hear me okay? Good. My internet is a little bit crotchety in the cold weather, so if I start to get staticky, Will, you can let me know and I can turn off my video. I'm going to speak for maybe 20 to 25 minutes and give you an overview of this most recent trip that we took to Alabama, and then invite David and Becky to add their perspectives on what the trip meant to them. We have two more people who are with us, Beryl Harper and Cindy Nottage, who are members of Dave's church, Community Church of Durham. So I'd also welcome both of them to share their perspectives, and hopefully we can entice them to read their poetry, which I have transcribed. I'm going to start with a PowerPoint. So let's see if we can share this screen successfully. come back here. Were you able to see that? Were you able
Sure
to
were.
Were you able to hear me?
We're able to hear you now. We didn't hear you talking then. Try one more time.
Okay.
So I am seeing, Joel, that your microphone is muted through Zoom at the moment. So try hitting space. That might unmute you.
You know what happened when I screen shared, I automatically went on mute. Let me try it one more time. I've never had that happen before.
No, that's a new one for me too.
So, Will, something new I've never run across before. I'm now unable to screen share and actually talk to you in a way that you can hear me.
Is there any way going through your phone you could do the talking?
I can do the screen share, Becky. I've got the PowerPoint loaded up over here.
I think I'm going to switch back and forth, so I'd rather not do that.
Oh, you'd rather not have me share the PowerPoint?
So, Will, I think what I'd like you to do is, oh, for goodness sake.
Joel, can I just say that I am feeling all kinds of compassion for you right now. I mean, just the deepest compassion for you.
Oh, for goodness sake.
How's that? So Joel, you can talk. I'll share. Does that work?
Can you hear me now?
We can.
You can. Oh, okay. Hooray! Thank you for your patience.
So just let me know when you need me to advance the slides.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start with something that hadn't been in our previous presentations. I think many of you know that there was a series of defacements with racist graffiti among, I think, 16 targeted companies, enterprises in Portsmouth a week ago Saturday, and including Temple Israel. And rather than responding to hate with hate or darkness with darkness, I want to give a shout out to Black Lives Matter Seacoast for responding to hate with love. If you don't know the story, what they did was organized local florists to donate flowers, a bouquet for each of the targeted companies. And here you see Clifton West Jr., who is the director of Black Lives Matter Seacoast, offering offering flowers to a member of Temple Israel, who I'm sure Emma can identify. One flower for each of the concentration camps in Eastern Europe. And next slide, please, Will. So, can you back up one? So I really want to give a shout out to everybody in Black Lives Matter Seacoast, including Clifton West Jr., for doing what motivated us to go to Alabama, which was, next slide, please, to really embody the spiritual message of MLK, responding to darkness, not with darkness, but to light, responding to hatred, not with hatred, but with love. Next slide, please. Some of you know about the Compassionate Listening Project. Very briefly, it's been around for about 35 years, and it's an organization that teaches listeners how to create safe space for speakers to be able to express themselves honestly and fully in search of what you might call their deep truth. It's based on the recognition that each of us has the ability to find our own truth. And then if we can stand in the shoes of others, even those we strongly disagree with, we can often see the world through their eyes and understand the world as they understand it. One of the founders of the Compassionate Listening Project described it with this little summary. We must listen. We must listen and listen and listen. We must listen for the truth in our opponent, and we must acknowledge it. After we've listened long enough, openly enough, and with a desire to really hear, we may be given the opportunity to speak our truth. We may even have the opportunity to be heard. For no one and no one side is the sole repository of truth, but each of us has a spark of it within. So perhaps with compassion as our guide, that spark in each of us can become a glow, and then perhaps a light. And we will watch one another in awe as we become illuminated. And then perhaps that spark, this glow, this light, will become the enlightening energy of love that will save all of us. Next slide, Will. So as we go forward, you might ask yourself, make note of something that you learned during this presentation, something that surprised you, something that challenged you, or something you want to know more about. And we're going to save the last 15 minutes for Q&A. Next slide, Will. So why go to Alabama? One of the people we met, historian Edwin Bridges, who wrote a wonderful lay history of the state of Alabama and who we met there, a friend of Gray Fitzgerald, who many of you know, wrote in the introduction to his book that almost every great theme in American history can be found in the story of Alabama. And yet almost none of our travelers had ever been to Alabama before. Next slide. This is the 20 of us minus our esteemed photographer, Becky Field, who is taking the photo and will appear in very few of the pictures that you see going forward. But thank goodness a couple of us took photos to prove that she, in fact, was there. The woman on the right, the Black woman, Wanda Battle, is someone you're going to meet in just a few minutes. Now, you can see there's a certain demographic going on here, right? So everybody's of a certain age, a certain color of hair, if they have any hair at all. Some of us look more youthful than others, but for the most part, this is the kind of cohort that we get on these compassionate listening journeys, whether to Israel, Palestine, or sub-Saharan Africa, Northern Ireland, and now Alabama. It's a certain group of people that we would like to expand. We would like to really try to get more people with different skin colors and more people across the age spectrum. Next slide, Will. And this is the route we took. Everything is very compact. Why Alabama? Well, one reason is because there are so many amazing segments of the American civil rights movement so close to one another. We landed in Montgomery. We spent 4 nights there, traveled by bus to Selma and spent 2 nights there, made a little loop to Greensboro and Marion, came back to Selma, and then spent the last 2 nights in Birmingham. Total hours of driving was just a little under 5 hours. Next slide. Downtown Montgomery is very compact, and the places that we visited while we were there were all within walking distance. We stayed on the far left there, that farthest red ellipse, the Spring Hill Suite Marriott, which was right across from the Dreamland restaurant where you can do a deep dive into Southern cuisine. The Legacy Museum is a block and a half away. On the far right, you can see the Alabama State Capitol. So everything is very close, very accessible by foot. Next slide. So we stayed in Spring Hill Suites, which is a beautifully restored building that was from the 19th century. It was a cotton warehouse, and we learned that it was a cotton warehouse while we were there. Many of us felt that there were spirits on Commerce Street. If you don't know, Commerce Street is the epicenter of the slave trade for the entire North American continent in the 18th and 19th centuries. Some of us, and that's Rosa Parks in the lower left, and she got on the bus that started the bus boycott back in 1955, just a block away from where we were staying. And of course, John Lewis was indeed here. Now, some of us had a sense that there were more than just bales of cotton in that warehouse that was converted into a suite. And one of them is with us tonight, Cindy Nottage. Next slide, please, Will. And Cindy, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you would like to read this, I would be delighted. And if you prefer that I do it, I'm happy to read it.
Why don't you do it, Joel? I want to hear your voice read the poem, okay?
Okay. I didn't warn Cindy, and I didn't warn Beryl that I'm going to invite you as well. This journey, unlike any of the other compassionate listening journeys that I've been on, generated a wellspring of poetry from 5 different people. And I wasn't aware of it at the time until I got home. I discovered that people were very busy conveying the experience through poetry. The spirits in this room haunt me. The bricks made by the hands of slaves drip with their blood. The walls and ceiling that enclose them in agony echo with their cries. Who are they? Children frightened and alone? Mothers waiting for their babies? Fathers stripped of their dignity, unable to care for those they love? The shame of my ancestors pierces my soul, and their shame becomes my own. How can I help? What will soothe their anguish? Will this journey, listening to the stories of those impacted by the days of slavery, quiet their spirits, bring peace to their souls, staunch the bleeding, give them the comfort so starkly missing in this room? Do they need me to accept my complicity in their fate, to understand that I am one with those who perpetrated this horror? Morning comes and I walk away, leaving behind my blessings, prayers, and gratitude for opening my eyes and heart, for the lessons they have taught me, for the energy to carry their stories home. Although I want them to find peace, I know their job is not done. They will continue to moan and bleed, allowing others who sleep here to remember their story. Cindy, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for writing that. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for naming something that many of us felt but couldn't actually envision. Next slide, please, Will. So I'm going to give you a little introduction to some of the people we met, give you a little taste of what the experience was like. This is Wanda Battle. Wanda comes from a storied Montgomery family that's lived in Montgomery for generations. She's in her 60s, and she's lived through all the major civil rights moments of the 20th and 21st century. She gives a bus tour now, and she shows Montgomery from the perspective of her own and her family's history. And what I'm going to do with each of the people that I present to you is to share the impressions of some of our fellow travelers and what they wrote about the different people that we met. Wanda had us swaying and clapping and smiling and singing the minute we got on the bus. I will think of Wanda's spirit when I feel small. I love the local perspective of Miss Wanda. She had wonderful energy. I love starting the day with song. Next slide, Will. This is Ed Bridges. This is Gray Fitzgerald's very good college friend, who is the state archivist for Alabama. And he put together this magnificent little museum, beautifully curated, that we spent a couple hours touring, and then we had a listening session with Ed afterwards. And Ed was the one who wrote the textbook for lay people, and also said almost every great theme in American history can be found in the story of Alabama. During the time we spent with him, he explained why that was. And here's what some people said about Ed. I especially appreciated his lessons, starting with the first Alabamians who predated the Europeans by over 10,000 years. Really puts things into perspective. The entire tour was fascinating and helpful in putting the rest of our journey in context. His explanation about the yeoman farmers gave me a new understanding of deep-rooted values and how they still play out generations later. Next slide. We went upstairs then and just asked Ed to tell us about himself, anything he wanted to share with us, and we had a listening session. And Ed took off his professional coat, so to speak, and kind of pulled up his pants cuffs and just started to tell us about his own story. And here's what people said about Ed. This was perhaps the most inspirational experience of the entire trip. His incredible fund of knowledge, his commitment to Alabama, his courageous, life-changing perspective, his capacity to live that out in such creative ways, and his humility. I am left with hope and awe and gratitude. Another wrote, I was deeply touched by Ed's honest sharing of being a defender of segregation as a young man before he went away to study history and started questioning his old beliefs. Another wrote, Ed dabbed his eyes after receiving a compassionate listener's reflection that the museum illustrates the same qualities and values that Ed seems to cherish: truth, scholarship, fairness, compassion, understanding, and service. His response, this museum is my life story. Next slide, please, Will. The next day, we visited two of the masterpieces of Bryan Stevenson, the Legacy Museum, which I think every American should tour, and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, known as the Lynching Museum. The Legacy Museum is a visceral experience, and here's what a few people shared about that. The first large screens of the ocean's roiling surface set the stage, and that's the entry on the left there. There are waves in the background projected onto the walls, giving the sense of what it was like to be in the Middle Passage. Grueling to absorb that much human misery in one place. Sickened by the pictures of people crammed into the belly of ships to be transported to America. Amazed by the strength and resilience of Blacks to say, we will love you until you can't hate us anymore. And then to march for freedom with a commitment to nonviolence. Next slide, Will. National Memorial for Peace and Justice is up on a hill about a mile away from the Legacy Museum. It was the cover story of the New York Times Sunday magazine in 2018. And indeed, the country had never seen anything like this. Next slide, Will. Several other comments. That's Becky in the lower left, so you can see she indeed was there. I was so disturbed by the number of people who were lynched, even children, and not just in the South, and as recently as 1952. The debriefing sessions were very helpful, starting with the meditation. They enabled the group to bond and for each of us to process the hard experiences. Next slide, Will. Now, to my surprise, Dave Grishaw-Jones was keeping his blog while he was on the trip and writing poetry and amazing, insightful reflections on what we had been through. And he wrote this the day after we had been at the Legacy Museum. And Dave, I'm wondering if you would want to read this.
Happy to, Joel. I called this An American Crossroads. Among these pilgrims, faces washed by tears, I am an abolitionist, my heart quickened by visions of justice and kindness and a purposeful, beloved community. The Spirit beckons from a future of possibilities. Among these pilgrims, voices heavy with history, I am an investor from Boston, a slave trader from Rhode Island, and I am acquiescent and comfortable, unwilling to wander off the well-traveled path of privilege. The Spirit summons me now from this bewildering crossroads. Among these pilgrims, aching with unmanageable hope, humbled by the bruising paradox of conscience, I am one with a circle that turns around an exasperating and eternal axis of ambiguity, nuance. And I turn with them all toward grace, toward being, toward home. Maya said to North and South, to the whole of us, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. And among these pilgrims, I can choose again to believe that she was right.
Thank you, Dave. And perhaps later you can share with us some of the reflections that you articulated during those several days. Will, can you give us the next slide, please? The next day we met with Jay Hinton. He's an amateur historian and a lawyer, with his friend Bob Wieland, who is the curator of the first White House of the Confederacy, where Jeff Davis lived for the first 6 months of the Civil War. Jay is the guy in the tan jacket there, holding forth, and he is a proponent of the lost cause. He was making a case that the Civil War was in fact not about slavery. It was about states' rights. And it was about the dignity of the Southern culture. He came armed with a whole slew of books, which you can see in front of him, and in some ways kind of used that as a defense attorney might make his case. Here's what some people said about Jay. Jay is a fascinating person. He says how much he appreciates what we're doing and listening with open minds, and yet he is hiding behind a wall of books. I sense he has a warm and generous heart. Another compassionate listener wrote, I have work to do on my own anger, not too compassionate right now. And someone else said, my learning continued in our circle as we debriefed, and it showed me the importance of community. People shared their still raw feelings with honesty and courage. And for me, an important question was posed by Julia, one of our fellow travelers. May we interact with Jay without Jay in the room? And the answer became very obvious because we didn't stop talking about him for a long time. Next slide, Will. We then went to Selma, and we met with Cheryl Smedley on the left there, who's the Director of Chamber of Commerce. That's Yael, the leader in the middle. And Jackie Smith, the owner of the coffee shop, which is the social hub of the city of Selma. In the middle there, you can see Jackie just delighted that we brought down New Hampshire maple syrup. She was over the moon and had to get a photo and put it on Facebook. And the person on the right is Diane Harris, who was a 15-year-old girl on Bloody Sunday and was chased back to the chapel by police on horseback. And here's what some people said. Oh, let me say one other thing. On the bottom right there, you can see that sign segregating white and colored people using the drinking fountain. I put that in because when Jackie was growing up in Selma, she was not allowed inside the coffee shop. She had to get her food through the takeout window. And now, 50 years later, she owns the coffee shop. So some things have actually gotten better. Here's what people said about our trip to the coffee shop. Diane must have told her story 1,000 times, yet she continues to bring it alive by telling it as if it happened yesterday. Another. Picturing young Diane and her brother running back to the church, chased by a man on a horse, wanting to help a woman who had fallen to the ground, but having to leave her behind, only to be beaten by a vigilante. Such horror. Next slide, Will. That's the Pettus Bridge, a couple blocks away. And that's Becky. Next slide. Here's what people wrote about walking across the bridge. Remembering those who crossed the bridge, asking myself if I would have had the courage, being aware of my privilege of never having to find out. And here it is. I think we're, what, 68 years from Bloody Sunday tomorrow. March 7th, yes, 1965. Next slide, please. We then went to the old Live Oak Cemetery, which is a monument to the lost cause. And here's what people wrote about that. The atmosphere here was the stuff of literature, the lighting, the words at the gravestones, the obvious care invested in maintaining the site. Wondering what stories these trees could tell. The glow of the sun filtering through the live oaks was ethereal. Reading about Nathan Bedford Forrest, that's the general on the left, and how his plaque presented a one-dimensional, polished version of who he was, upholding him as a hero. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead, and I'll ask you, Will, let's go one slide at a time. And we'll have to skip over Project Horseshoe Farm. One more slide. Okay, so this is important to point out that there was a lot of heavy lifting, a lot of seriousness, and yet we also had time to bond and have fun. And here's what some people said about the community that we created among us. As we sat at two big tables, enjoying our food and conversation, and as I looked around, taking in everyone, a feeling of warmth came up, and I realized that my circle of friends with every one of you in it just became a lot bigger. Another person wrote, very honored to be sitting there at that circle, listening to the insights of our group, one by one, such honesty, transparency, gratitude, and learning. Next slide, Will. We then went to Birmingham for the last 2 days of our trip, and we spent a day and an overnight and the next morning with Ron Warren, who is a professional native flutist, and he chose a Cherokee, brought 4 of his flutes, and played inside the Birmingham Museum of Art on Sunday, and then outside on the front veranda of the hotel during rush hour the very next morning. Here's what people wrote. With his words and his music, I feel that the circle was complete. Everyone was present on this journey. The voices of elders, the voices of young people, the voices of indigenous people through Ron. So grateful. Another wrote, Ron gave me hope that a new way is opening. We, all of us, are kindred spirits. And finally, what a gift to listen to Ron's flute conversation with Mockingbird. It brought a big smile to my face. This happened the next morning during rush hour. We're out on the veranda on one of the main commuting streets, and Ron starts to play, and I'm thinking, this isn't the Birmingham Museum of Art. The acoustics are not going to work, but Ron's flute is his connection to the world wherever he is. And he started playing, and then there was a response. I didn't recognize what it was at first. And he played some more, and then there was another response. And before we knew it, he was in conversation with Mockingbird, connecting to the world as it was in that moment. Next slide, please, Will. And this inspired Beryl, who's with us today, to write this poem. And Beryl, I invite you to read it if you'd like.
Well, I wasn't planning on it, Joel, but I will. So
I
this
can read
is,
it if you prefer, but
I think I'm okay.
Wonderful.
Sure. Mockingbird sings. Mockingbird sings at the dawn of a new day as a black baby boy is born to the light. Slave mother whispers to her beautiful son, listen to blackbird singing in the dead of night. Mockingbird sings by a wooden shack where a little boy plays in the dirty sand. He sees a bird with a wounded wing and feeds it a bug from his grubby hand. Mockingbird sings above the cotton row as a field hand bends down over his hoe. Blackbird swoops in and grabs a seed, winking at the field hand, flying low. Mockingbird sings near the lynching tree. As white crowds gather, a mother kneels to pray. A handsome man is hung, a noose round his neck. Blackbird chants an elegy on that tragic day. Take these sunken eyes and learn to see. All your life, you were only waiting for this moment to be free. Mockingbird is mute by an unmarked grave. Families cry in the pouring rain. Blackbird is grieving in the dead of night. Wind is howling with terror and pain. Mockingbird sings with a Cherokee flute on a city street early in the morning. Blackbird flies in. They join together to offer a challenge or maybe a warning. Take these broken wings and learn to fly. All your life, you were only waiting for this moment to arise.
Thank you, Beryl. You can stop the screen share at this point, Will. So you've met about fewer than half of the people that we met on the journey. And we've got reflections on all the rest of them too, but I think it's more important at this time to open it up to Dave, who was on the journey, and to Becky for your impressions. And if Beryl and Cindy would like to offer some reflections as well, we invite you to share what this was like for you, and then we'll open it up to questions from the rest of you. Becky, you haven't spoken yet. Would you like to start?
Sure, I'd be glad to add a few reflections because this trip had a tremendous impact on me. When I heard about it, my arm had to be twisted to go to this, and I wasn't really thinking too much about it ahead of time. I was one of the participants that Joel mentioned that had never been to Alabama, never really thought too much about it. And as some of you know, I'm a freelance photographer, and most of my work is focusing on immigrants and refugees. So I thought, well, what's this have to do with my work? But in fact, this trip turned out to be life-shaping. I thought I knew quite a bit about the civil rights movement and about racial justice issues. I had studied a lot of history in my schooling years, and so I thought I really understood a lot of issues around this. But what I didn't really understand, as much as all the book learning had helped me, I didn't understand the human toll that this took in terms of the emotions, the social, and the physical impact on Black Americans during this terrible chapter of our history. We went with an amazing tool, and that was compassionate listening. I didn't know anything about compassionate listening until we started some of the training before we left. And I learned that it was a way to explore some of the deep, fractious issues in our history, and a way, in this case, of the treatment of Blacks in our country. I was really amazed during the course of this trip at the power of compassionate listening for helping not only us to understand and to hear these stories, but I was also amazed at how people who shared their stories really expressed how powerful it was for them to feel heard. It was a way of opening up deeper conversations and really getting into some of the much deeper issues that we were exploring. I really appreciated on this trip that we met people on both sides of the issues, those that were obviously very much involved in the civil rights movement and participants of it as young people, as Joel has mentioned, but also those who were more supportive of the Confederate viewpoint. There were less of those that were more sympathetic to the Confederate thinking. And one thing I would love to have heard was to have heard more of that. But maybe understandably, they were a little hesitant to talk to a group like ours. I was very impressed with the power of walking the history, quite literally walking through the streets of these towns and cities in Alabama, but also walking the emotional pathway of this history, which I had never really done and really had tremendous impact on me. Probably the most significant for me was the Legacy Museum. It was very difficult for me to walk through that museum. Partly just the suffering that we saw through that very beautiful and magnificently done museum, but also because I started then to see the linkages between the ways we treated and do still treat Black people and the ways we are treating immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. And all of a sudden in that museum, I started seeing the Black faces of my African friends that now are living in New Hampshire. And that's what really hit me just upside the head. It was really, really difficult. Overall, the trip was a wonderful length. It was great food, maybe a little bit too much fried food, but it was really good Southern cooking, and I appreciated that. Also, I want to mention that we had debriefing sessions each day. As Joel mentioned, these were not always easy days. There was a lot of heavy material. And so as a group, we got together at the end of the day and talked about what we experienced, what we saw, and how we felt about it. That was very important to me. I think also this trip has shaped my thinking about immigration. It's given me some ideas of other photographic projects. I'm always looking for more photographic projects. And I really think that this has given me some perspective of how we not only treat Blacks in our community, immigrants in our community, but also others, you know, in the broad sense of people that are different than we are. So this trip was well organized. It was well thought through, planned out, and really opened my eyes to some very important issues in this country and made me feel much more connected to Alabama and some of the issues that they're dealing with even today. So I would do this trip again in a heartbeat. And I really encourage anybody that's listening to this program to consider going on this trip. It really was a remarkable, remarkable experience. So thank you, Joel. Thank you to the organizers and Yael. And thank you to all my fellow participants. We had a great time together and I really appreciate all your support during it.
Thank you, Becky. Dave.
Well, I'll just second everything that Becky has said. And, you know, I was one of 6 from our Durham congregation that traveled as a part of the 20. And I'll just say that was another gift of this whole experience to experience Alabama and to experience compassionate listening as a process with a small group from our congregation, because it's given us a chance to explore spirituality and faith together in a really interesting and important way. And Will started off this whole hour by asking a question about the spirituality of peacemaking and how do we keep it fresh and how do we sustain ourselves in the midst of all of the challenges that face us as peacemakers and activists. And I just think, Will, that's a key question for all of us. And what I experienced on the trip with Joel and Yael and all the others was a model for that, you know, a way to imagine and a way to keep engaged and keep fresh and keep creative in the midst of, you know, unimaginable challenges and pain. And I think it has a lot to do with relationships. I think that the genius of compassionate listening is that it really celebrates the power and the imagination that's possible in the context of really deep and committed human relationships. And you know, no one of us can tackle racism by ourselves, and no one of us can tackle climate change by ourselves. But in a thick web of really deep relationships, it becomes a little bit more possible to imagine taking all that on. And of course, it can't just be us. We've got to have other partners in the mix, the Ed Bridges and the Wanda Battles and the Mashonda Richardson, all those folks. So I came away from this trip just even more committed to, you know, to a spiritual practice that is committed to relationships and to deep, thoughtful conversation with people that I agree with and don't agree with. And I think that's the model for staying fresh and keeping committed. So thank you to Joel and all the others that made that possible.
Thank you, David. Before I will just offer one reflection of my own. This is the second time I had been to Alabama with the Compassionate Listening Project. And responding to darkness with darkness, responding to hate with hate is appropriate for where I was before I went to Alabama. That I was just as hateful and dark towards the people who I thought were disrupting and dismantling our democracy as they were of me. And one of the gifts of compassionate listening over the years, both here and in Israel-Palestine, has been to recognize my own biases and my own darkness, and to know that I am part of the solution only if I can recognize them and blot out the darkness with my own light and my own hatred with my own love. So at this point, I'd like to open it up to anyone who has something that interested you, something that challenged you, something you want to know more about, something you don't understand and would like to question. I apologize, Beryl and Cindy. I would love to invite your input, but in the interest of time, I think we need to go to the Q&A here.
See, Walter's hand is up.
Yeah, Walter, you're on mute.
The lawyer who was telling the story of the lost cause. I imagine that he finds like-minded people down there who are very excited to hear his version of the history. In your session with him, you gave him a chance to give his story. Did you sense any movement in that your presence may have caused in him?
Mm-hmm. And that's a question we get a lot. Does this have an influence on the speakers? And sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But as a compassionate listener, I go into it with no expectations, because if there is, then it's a transaction.
Mm-hmm.
There will be reciprocity. But you know, that first quote I read by Jean Nunson Hoffman summarizes, if we listen, and we listen, then sometimes we have a chance to be heard as well. I'm going to answer this, Dave and Becky, because I've met Jay 3 times, and I've developed a friendship with him, and he wasn't at his best when we were there this last time. The first time we were there, it was more spacious, we had more time, and he really let down his guard. And I came to recognize, as he told his own personal story, that much of what fueled his advocacy for the lost cause was really a question about basic dignity and the disrespect that Northerners, and I take the hit for this as well, use a broad brush to depersonalize, dehumanize people in the South. And he's fighting. He knows where every one of his grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents are buried. He has a fierce love of the land, and he is intensely prickly that we Northerners don't see any value, broad brush, in Southerners' connection to their land. And we've had subsequent conversations, Walter, in which he has moved a bit. We've talked about the Abenaki folks here and the Hannah Duston Memorial and keeping monuments. Do you preserve monuments and how do you contextualize them? And he was very interested in what we're doing here in New Hampshire with the Hannah Duston Memorial. Other questions? Donna.
I had a question very similar to Walter's, and you've talked about it a bit, but I'm deeply interested in learning more from people who do things that seem unthinkable. The people who spray painted swastikas on businesses in Portsmouth. I've spent my life working with adolescents from very, very traumatic backgrounds. And I am always curious about what sets somebody on a pathway toward that kind of hatred, toward that kind of, I have to make a statement because I'm hurting so deeply inside and nobody gets it, or something like that. I don't know. But I'm wondering if in your visits, you've heard stories like that give you some understanding.
Does anyone want to address that? I can give you stories from my 4 compassionate listening trips to Israel and Palestine. Sitting in the home of a Rebbitzin, the wife of a rabbi of one of the original settlements in Samaria in the West Bank, telling us her story on why she thinks Palestinians are invented people, and how they've appropriated all the culture of the Israeli Jews, and how they need to keep their place. We were happy to have them here, but they have to stay in their place. And then that afternoon, going down to the valley of the village of Nabi Saleh, which is a kilometer away, 2 worlds on the opposite side of the universe. None of them have ever met. And we hear the stories of the people who live in Nabi Saleh, the Palestinians, and the abuse they take from the Israelis. And you hear the horrendous stories of assassinations and terrorist attacks in the middle of the night on both sides. And when you listen with this tool of compassionate listening, I can really put myself in the shoes of both sides. I can really understand the trauma that runs so deep, and also see the opposite of that. Palestinian youth and Israeli youth, settlers. There was an encounter we witnessed between Ariel, a 15-year-old Israeli settler, and 18-year-old Muhammad, a Palestinian living in the West Bank, who couldn't imagine the humanity of the other side until they got together at an organization called Roots, and came to learn that, in fact, these people are kind of a lot like me and want the same kind of things. And within this kind of safe framework, decades of enmity and hatred and fear dissolve. And I have witnessed that every time I have gone.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think one of the lessons, or one of the reflections that I came away from this trip with is around the intergenerational dimension of trauma, and how a lot of the trauma that we see erupting in our own moment is related not only to individuals and individual stories, but the way that that trauma has been passed down generation to generation in some cases, and the ways that we heal that trauma and or the ways that we address that trauma have to sort of take all that into account, that it's a complicated, difficult brew, and again, compassionate listening offers us one way to kind of hold the complexity of all that trauma and all those generations in the midst as we listen to one another.
Unfortunately, I think that is our time together. So I want to say thank you so much to Joel, to Becky, to David, and to Beryl, and was it Cindy who was also on the trip? Who the folks who were on it who came to add or just to be present, and thank you for those who weren't there who came to listen. I know there are I've been monitoring the live streams, and I know there are folks out there who are watching who aren't with us here, but just deeply appreciate you sharing your insights from this trip. I heard Joel talk about dignity and the reality that each person's story and perspective is tied to their dignity, especially when you were talking about the gentleman who was defending the Confederacy, and how much dignity and plays into that. And I'm reminded of our Thursday night conversation right now, which is a book study on the book Dignity by Donna Hicks, which talks about the impact of dignity on peace building and international relations, and the importance of dignity in ending conflicts. And it keeps coming back to that holding the humanity of each other, respecting each other's dignity, as being kind of the key to ending violence. And I really appreciate you guys talking about this trip, and please stay in touch, folks, and we'll hopefully have a chance to do this again sometime soon. So I'm going to go ahead and say goodnight.
Thank you, Will.
Thanks for the invitation.